Livsmedelstillgången är av avgörande betydelse för den sociala situationen och välfärden av varje samhälle och civilisation. Som en följd av det är kontrollen över livsmedelsproduktionen ett nödvändigt verktyg för den som vill utöva makt. Detta har i sin tur medfört en effektivisering av livsmedelsframställningen där genmanipulering, GMO, av födoämnen spelar en allt större och mer avgörande roll både för näringskedjan och därmed för den mat som människor äter ur ett geopolitiskt maktperspektiv. Den miljöpåverkan som detta skapar för människor har väckt en rädsla och ett växande socialt engagemang. Livsmedelsindustrins maktambitioner har fått människor att reagera. Över hela jorden växer proteströrelser mot vad människor upplever som ett verkligt men dolt hot mot liv och hälsa. Här följer en intervju med journalisten, författaren och föredragshållaren William Engdahl. So, Mr. Engdahl, Mr. William Engdahl, perhaps you can make a short introduction and presentation of yourself.
What should I say about myself? I'm originally born in the United States. I've traveled around most of the world in the last 38 years first as a journalist, now more as an author and a lecturer on essentially one central theme, and that is the misuse of power by very powerful people. And that led me to write a series of books. One of them, the first one, was called A Century of War, Anglo-American Oil Politics, which goes into the period from 1880s when coal was replaced by oil for the British Navy up until the current situation with the Iraq War in 2003 and beyond. And the second book was called Seeds of Destruction, and that's about the misuse of power by powerful people over our food supply. I'm living in Germany, where I've been for some 29 years, and spend most of my time writing and lecturing.
Can you please brief us in short terms what defines the term GMO?
GMO stands for genetically modified organisms, and it's a project that was the dream of a group of people going back to the starting of the eugenics movement, but certainly in 1938, when a very influential foundation in the United States, the Rockefeller Foundation, created a new area of biology that they called molecular biology. And their idea in creating this, they financed various professors at Cambridge University in England and California Institute of Technology in California and others. The idea was to take life, the complexity of life, and reduce it to a single gene, DNA, traits and so forth, and then manipulate that gene. And the reason they were so obsessed with this idea, and still are, is that they wanted to see if it were possible first to create a master race, and this is no exaggeration, and secondly to find a genetic way to get rid of what they considered inferior people of less intelligence and so forth. And that, to my mind, is a very unintelligent idea. But that's the origins of GMO, and the idea is to shoot a foreign substance into a gene of a plant like soybeans or corn and change the traits of that plant so that it's resistant to certain chemicals or whatever.
When it comes to terms of consequences over time, according to GMOs, what do you expect imposes the greatest risk to humans and society?
It's very difficult to say, because since it was commercialized in the United States in 1992, the president at that time, George Bush Sr., met with Monsanto, the leading GMO company in the world today, corporation, and worked out a deal with Monsanto that the US government would never test GMO seeds for health and safety, and it would never label the seeds or label food products containing GMO, things like Kellogg's cornflake that you get on the shelf and so. So to this day, Americans don't know what they're eating, but most of their diet is GMO. At the same time, in the last 20 years, you've had an epidemic rise in allergies, in severe diseases, diabetes, and so forth. And nobody knows the causality and how much of that is related to the food we're eating with GMO.
Starvation seems to be the most common argument
For GMOs.
For GMOs, yes. Yeah. Used by the companies like Monsanto and the giants in the GMO business, yes. Do you think that's an honest way to describe it?
It's a lie. There's no, let me explain that. There's no seed on the market today in the world that has been genetically modified to increase the harvest yield per hectare. There's no seed that's been genetically modified to reduce the amount of chemical weed killer herbicides that plant requires. So the PR argument of Monsanto and company is that this is the solution to world hunger.
Yeah.
This is a fraud, it's a lie, it's an untruth, because there is no increased food supply from using GMO seeds versus normal corn or soybeans or rice or wheat, whatever.
Okay. Given that GMO seems to be a more inevitable thing in our common days, what do you think are coming up in the future?
I personally don't think it's inevitable. I think the project of Monsanto and the US Department of Agriculture, which is complicit in this attempt to proliferate GMO around the world, is in grave, grave danger right now, and that's good news. Why do I say that? The march against Monsanto is an example I'd like to use. A year ago, in May, there was a worldwide series of spontaneous demonstrations and protests against Monsanto. The background is that a housewife, a mother in Utah, was so outraged by the fact that Monsanto, she had read in the newspaper, Monsanto and the GMO lobby had spent millions, tens of millions of dollars to defeat a labeling referendum in California. And so she started a Facebook page, one housewife in a remote state, and said, let's have a march against Monsanto on the 13th of May, 2013. Well, that went viral, and in 52 countries, millions, literally millions of people, cities all over the United States, all over Europe, had marches against Monsanto. And it wasn't controlled by NGOs and the usual array of organizations. It was spontaneous. And that really shook them to their roots. They did not expect such a thing. And started a PR campaign right after that in Europe to create the image that they were withdrawing from the GMO attempt in the European Union. They're not, but they're trying to create that impression. So I don't think it's at all inevitable that the GMO is going to take over the world. They're certainly trying, and they have an agenda for trying, but I don't see it as... Well, one of the problems with GMO is if a farmer plants Monsanto GMO seeds on his field and the farmer next to him has GMO-free fields, say soybeans or whatever, corn, the contamination comes from the wind, from nature, blowing the seeds across to the neighbor's field. And Monsanto has a battery of lawyers, very aggressive bulldog lawyers, that go around and get evidence of the spread, the contamination of neighboring fields that are non-GMO, and then they start to sue that farmer for stealing Monsanto seeds without a license. And they've won in Canada and the United States, numerous cases like this.
Do you think the GMO business is fully aware of the biological consequences?
Oh yes.
They are?
There's no question in my mind. There have been documented instances, whistleblowers who were hired to do tests on the safety with rats of GMO for Monsanto so that they could claim that their tests showed that everything's okay. And they were told when rats died, they were told to ignore that as an outlier event. And they had conscience and blew the whistle afterwards. Okay. So they're very well aware. They're very well aware. And they don't care. They have an agenda.
Okay. They have an agenda. It's just for profit.
No. The agenda is not profit.
Okay.
The agenda goes back to something called eugenics.
Yeah, okay.
And the people who are behind GMO, behind the attempt to control life and patent it, come out of the eugenics movement. The American Eugenics Society was the major financial support for that, was the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefeller family. They started the Population Council in 1953 to find ways of reducing global population. They've been, unfortunately, pretty successful. The agenda of GMO, Monsanto and company, Dow and DuPont and Syngenta, is about controlling life on this planet. And it goes back to a statement by Henry Kissinger in the 1970s. If you control oil, he said, you can control entire nations. If you control food, you control the people. And I think that begins to get at what the GMO long-term strategy is.
I heard that Rockefeller Foundation initiated the whole scheme. Mm-hmm. And there would have been a front figure in some way mm-hmm. in America for that.
Well, Margaret Sanger, who founded something called Planned Parenthood, was very much a out-front figure for the Rockefellers. She was intimately a family inner circle friend, and had a project in Harlem during the Great Depression called the Harlem Project. Harlem is a black neighborhood of New York City. And years later, someone managed to get a hold of her papers and letters and went through it and found a letter to a trusted friend of hers where she said, we must be extremely careful that the black Negro ministers that we're working with, she wrote, don't realize that what we're talking about is the extinction of the black race. Otherwise, they wouldn't cooperate with us anymore. So her agenda was that inferior people of black skin color or other non-white Anglo-Saxon features ought to be eliminated. They ought not to have babies. They ought not to reproduce. So that only us superior human beings like Margaret Sanger and John D. Rockefeller II and so are around to contemplate.
Okay. Sweden has been quite heavily into eugenics too, and do you know any certain connections maybe?
Well, I know Alva Myrdal, the wife of Gunnar Myrdal, was, I'm trying to think now when she wrote this, in the 1920s, I think she wrote a book on earlier, 20s and 30s. Yeah. So, but there's a, throughout Scandinavia, throughout England, and the interesting thing is in Germany, there was a very strong eugenics movement from the 1920s up until, well, right up until the end of the war, but up until 1939, German eugenics research was financed by the Rockefeller family, the Rockefeller Foundation. And they were quite open about it until the war broke out, and then they had to be a little bit politically correct, as you say.
Yeah.
So they stopped funding, but they supported it fully.
Yeah. It was a pretext for Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany. Yeah,
well, they funded the Kaiser Wilhelm research.
Yeah, but it was made as a copy of the Race Biological Institute in Uppsala in Sweden, that was founded in 1921.
Okay.
And since Sweden has quite a part in this matter, do you think Sweden is more or less than average when it comes to the GMO?
If Sweden is less than average or more than average when it comes to my knowledge, there's not widespread commercial planting of GMO in Sweden. There is in Spain, and a few other places in the EU, but largely the EU has resisted GMO, the population of the EU. I would hope it's the same in Sweden. I'm not an expert on internal Swedish agriculture policy, but I think there's a reason why in their gut instinct, 88% of the EU population that have been asked about this are against genetically modified food in their family diet.
Yeah. Given that Russia seems to impose legislation to ban the GMOs, how do you think that will affect the situation as a whole? Does it make a signal? Can it possibly make a difference for Sweden?
Well, yes, I think it will definitely make a difference. This is a quite recent decision of the Russian government. I was in Russia in summer of last year and met with a number of people who were actively trying to prevent GMO from spreading in Russia. Russia, keep in mind, Russian soil, as is Ukrainian soil for the most part, is some of the richest soil for agriculture in the world today. And the Western agribusiness multinationals are literally salivating at the chance of taking that soil and capturing it for GMO. So they've spent a huge lobbying effort since the collapse of the Soviet Union 20-some years ago in opening Russia to GMO, Monsanto and the rest. That, with the entrance of Russia recently into the World Trade Organization, looked like it was going to happen. Now, with all the aggressive saber-rattling coming from Washington and the EU against Russia over Ukraine, I think the Russians are doing a rethink and saying, why are we going to try to please you and destroy our food chain for you? So I think that's a very good development. I think other countries are going to look at that seriously and say, well, maybe we should do the same. China, there's an intense debate right now. I was there in January for a speech and was told that there's a whole mood change going on in the Chinese intellectual elites and also in the political elites over GMO. There are government ministers who want GMO and probably have been corrupted by Monsanto and company to do that, but there's a very strong resistance. So I think around the world this GMO question is not at all a done deal.
I've heard you lecture about the DNA being unstable. What do you think that imposes?
Well, here's a huge problem with the entire GMO project. Nobody knows. It's opening Pandora's box. Nobody knows in the world because Monsanto refuses to give its seeds in a neutral way for independent scientific study long term. The studies that have been done in various laboratories, such as Professor Seralini in France, they've been attacked as non-scientific, fraudulently attacked, and it's like the Spanish Inquisition of the Catholic Church in the medieval times. It's just, you can't have open and honest science. So nobody knows what we're playing with. We do know that it's GMO, the altering of the traits of a plant, or humans, or Dolly the pig for that matter, is inherently unstable. It's always switched on. It's going through mutations. We don't know. This is like the Andromeda strain of the Michael Crichton novel years ago.
Citing Russia Today last week, Moscow has no reason to encourage the production of genetically modified products.
Well, I think it's a national interest to simply do that. Other countries have done similar things, citing the health and safety of their population. I think that's what governments are there to do.
Yeah.
So I don't see it as radical.
So how come...
I see it as rational.
Yeah, okay. So how come not all governments do the same?
You tell me. I know the United States government is run by Monsanto since 1992. They run the Food and Drug Administration policy. Michael Taylor is the person who decides what happens with GMO in the United States, and he's a former vice president of Monsanto. this is I think this is not a normal for-profit corporation that we're dealing with Monsanto and company. I think this is a strategic agenda of certain very powerful people who are powerful enough to influence U.S. government policy, regardless of who's the president. Everyone from Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, all of them have just followed like lambs the GMO Monsanto agenda.
The people behind Monsanto, the powerful people with a global agenda.
Yeah.
Can you
sure.
give us a hint?
Sure. Bill Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a major stockholder of Monsanto. Bill Gates, the son of the former president of Margaret Sanger's Planned Parenthood, the eugenicist, is also a eugenicist. He thinks there are too many people in the world and that's creating global warming, according to one speech he gave. Another major interest holder in Monsanto, and has been since World War I, are the Rockefeller family. In fact, about a year ago, a director of Monsanto passed away, and he was 103 years old. His name was William Rockefeller, part of the Rockefeller dynasty. So, and of course the mutual funds that own stock in all significant corporations. But the other thing is that Monsanto is in league with the U.S. government, using the powers and the persuasion of the U.S. government around the world to spread their GMO patented seeds. So U.S. Department of Agriculture holds a patent together with Monsanto for Terminator technology today. And they're making no attempts to get rid of that.
No. And the bigger scheme
of GMO, I think it's about what I referred to earlier, the quote from Henry Kissinger: control food, you control the people. I think this is a significant part. The entire monopolization or cartelization of agriculture since the 1950s started first, the project out of Harvard Business School, Ray Goldberg and John Davis, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, the project. The idea was to do with food, do with agriculture, what they had done with oil, create a top-down vertical monopoly that controls the entire food market, first in the US and then spreading to Europe, Latin America, Africa, China, and so forth. Now you can go into a supermarket almost any place in the world, certainly that I've traveled to, and I've traveled quite a lot, and you'll see the same products: Nestle, Kellogg's Corn Flakes, and so forth. And the chicken that we eat in Europe, a good portion of it is imported. Now, why on God's earth do we need to import chicken and pay the transportation costs, fuel costs and everything to bring those chickens from South America to Europe? Why don't we have free-roaming chickens like we used to that are healthy? Well, these are industrially produced chickens. They're fed a diet of GMO soybeans, GMO corn, and antibiotics. That's essentially what we eat when we buy a chicken at the supermarket shelf today. This is not food. This is an industrial product that is disguised to look like chicken. And unfortunately, that's the case with much of the food chain that we have access to today. Very little of it is genuinely organic and natural. We have an unnatural diet, and that's making unnatural illnesses and diseases and so forth for hundreds of millions of people around the world.
Do you have any hints about how dangerous it is because of the, what do you say, like if you eat it a few times or?
Okay. There was a study, the only study up in 20 years of commercialization of GMOs in France, that was published in a scientific journal, the Journal of Food and Toxicology, in September of 2012 by Professor Gilles-Éric Seralini and his group at Caen University in France. They studied control rats and GMO-fed rats in a variety of scenarios to see the effects over a 2-year average lifespan of the rats. all of the previous studies that were used to say that GMO is safe were done by Monsanto or the industry and given to the US government or to the EU. And those only went for 90 days. They cut it off at 90 days. Well, what Seralini's group found is that cancer tumors began appearing in these rats, GMO rats, only after 5, 6, 7 months. And then the symptoms really started showing. You had 5 times the death rate of GMO rats compared with non-GMO rats. You had organ damage, severe organ damage, liver, kidney especially. You had reproductive sterility or non-reproductive rats and so forth. So these results were published in this serious scientific journal and caused an uproar around the world. And what Monsanto and company did was get that hushed up by claiming it was an unscientific study, which is rubbish. It was a very scientific study, and it threatened the whole GMO project. So corrupt politicians in Brussels, corrupt scientists in Brussels at the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, dismissed the study and said no further research is needed. Well, to my mind, that's criminal behavior. That's criminal behavior for responsible people over food and safety in the European Union to say this is unscientific and we don't need to go any further. We're right and the Seralini study is wrong. What in the world, if you have one study that shows these alarming results? If I were the EU Commission, would say we will give grants to 100 different research institutes and universities, independent, to see if this is, whether it's scientific or unscientific, these results are so alarming we have to investigate further. No, they say no further research is needed. What is that for responsibility?
So what you're imposing is that the democratic system is broken since they don't act in the best will of the people.
Well, I don't know if the Brussels bureaucracy is a democratic system. I don't think there's any answerability in Brussels. That's one of the big problems. Okay. There's a democratic deficit, as they call it.
So what do you propose for a solution?
Well, I propose an immediate global ban on GMO, stop it immediately. A global ban on the weed killer that is, by contract, must be used with the GMO seeds. It's called Roundup or glyphosate variations. Because there are tests that have shown that's one of the most toxic chemicals out there, and it's the most widely used weed killer in the world. So stop all of this immediately, and if you want to continue research on a better way, a stable way to modify the traits of plants, okay, but in extremely controlled laboratory conditions, I don't think they'll find it, because I don't think you can alter life in the way that Rockefeller and Monsanto and these mad scientists think that they can. I don't think you can play God with life in any form.
Since the impact of the human being is quite severe, or so possibly can be severe anyway, do you really think they who makes this scheme consume the same food themselves?
The canteen at Monsanto does not serve any GMO food to its employees.
So they don't know.
But I don't think the well, look at Prince Charles in the UK. He's an ardent opponent of GMO. He's maybe a little bit more open, but you can be sure that most of the seriously wealthy people who are behind this, the Rockefellers and so, they have their organic farms, they have their safe food. They don't eat this.
So they just eat safe food?
Well, I presume they do.
Since nature is a balanced system, do you think it's possible for nature to recover from the GMO experiment?
Well, I'm not a biologist, but my opinion, nature is not a balanced system. It's a dynamic system. It's constantly evolving and changing. I think it's reversible. You can recover the soil that's been polluted by Roundup chemicals, toxins, and so forth. That takes years, an estimate perhaps 6, 7, 8 years, I don't know, it depends on how intense. So, but I think this is reversible, and we haven't gone that far. In the US, it's a horrendous situation. In Argentina, it's a horrendous situation with soybeans and so. But in Europe, it's by no means irreversible. So I think it can be changed. Yeah, sure.
Okay. That's good to hear. So, what do you think there is to do for the ordinary people who hears about this?
Oh, that's unlimited in potential. This is simply take responsibility for their family and for themselves and for their own lives. Take responsibility. Don't be passive. Take the example of the mother in Utah who started a Facebook page because she was so upset at the corruption of Monsanto in the electoral process. And that went viral worldwide and transformed the opposition to Monsanto and GMO overnight. So the creativity of people when they're fighting for something that's positive and valuable is unlimited. So there is no prescription. People are creative. They can come up with ways.
New World Order is a popular question.
Well, what I see, the driving force behind what we call today globalization is a handful of financial institutions in Wall Street and the City of London, and allied banks like Deutsche Bank in Germany today, UBS in Switzerland. And through the spreading of their monetary system, I think they want to try to control the world. If you want to use the term New World Order, I think what these people are driving at is a global homogenized fascist police state where most of the human beings on Earth are drones, slaves to their system, and they are the gods that sit on top of that and tell those drones what to do. To my mind, that's not exactly the direction I want to go with my life. So people have to decide. There are more of us than there are of them, and that's one reason they're so paranoid.
So we thank Mr. Engdahl for the very pleasant interview.
Thank you very much.